And turn to Genesis chapter 37. Book of Genesis chapter 37. Today we're going to talk about the story of Joseph, the things that happened to him, and the great example that he is to us. When we talk about Joseph, we tend to think of his story across his life, but I want to talk about at first the story of his life from the age of 17, which is where he really comes on the scene, until age 30. Now, at age 30, he is appointed as second in command in Egypt for the things he told Pharaoh that he needed to do to get ready for the famine that was coming. Well, Joseph, from age 17 to 30, most of us would probably curl up and die for the things that happened to him. It would be very difficult to live through the things that were done to him. We think of, at first, in chapter 37, his story is split up by this, not odd story necessarily, but story of Judah and his dealings with his daughter-in-law Tamar. That's in chapter 38. The story of Joseph starts in chapter 37, then 38 is about something else, 39 comes back to Joseph, and through the end of the book is really his story. In chapter 37, it starts off talking about his dreams that he has. And you will know all these. I'm not going to go into detail about the things he dreamed so that we can get to the main part of the lesson. His sheaves, he dreamed about his sheaves, the sheaves of him and his brothers standing up, and then their sheaves bowed down before his, and that's them paying homage to him in some way. They didn't like that when he told them that dream, and they thought that, well, you think you're going to rule over us like a king's going to rule over us? Little did they know that's exactly what was going to happen for whatever reason. He also dreams of the sun and the moon and the 11 stars. He says, paying homage to me. And at this, his father Israel has a little bit of a problem. Are your mother and I and your brothers going to bow down before you? But it says he did keep these things in mind. Look at Genesis chapter 37 and verse 7. Just want to read that there. There we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brother said to him, shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers, and and said, look, I have dreamed another dream. This time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this you dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So we have all of these dreams taking place. Obviously, God's trying to tell him something, maybe to prepare him in some way for something. We think about his dreams when we think about Joseph. We also think a lot about his hardships, don't we? Things, as I said, things that happened to him, if it were to happen to me, I don't know that I would continue on with life. Very difficult. He's ridiculed. In chapter 37, we read verse 8 and verse 10 about the dreams. The brothers don't like it. Then the father don't like it, and the brothers hate him even more for the things that he's dreaming, which he has no control over. So he's ridiculed. He's despised by his own family. He's sold into slavery by his own brothers. Look at Genesis chapter 37 and verse 28. Very heartbreaking scene, really. They've taken him. He's supposed to go and check on them to see how they're doing in this semi-far-off place where they're tending the sheep. They see him coming and say, there he is. There's a dreamer. Let's take him. Let's kill him. And they decided better of killing him. Let's not do that. We'll throw him in the pit. And then they see, verse 28, it says, then the Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt, the price of a slave. You sell your own brother. Can you imagine having that done to you? How low you would feel. You would feel low if your neighbor sold you. But for your own brother, it's just truly sad. When he's sold into slavery, of course, he's accused by his master's wife of trying to rape her. And then he's falsely imprisoned. We go over to chapter 39 for this. Genesis chapter 39, starting in verse 12. We'll read that entire thing there, going through verse 20, or starting in verse 11, or verse 10, I'm sorry. So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her, to lie with her, or to be with her. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. So it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, See, he has brought in to us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to lie with me. And I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened, when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until the master came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to mock me. And so it happened, as I lifted my voice and cried out, he left his garment with me and fled outside. So it was, when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, Your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison. Sold into slavery, then he does very well, gets put in the house of Potiphar, and then he's falsely accused and imprisoned. So he finds himself in an Egyptian prison. Still as a young man. He may have been 19 or 20 at this point, very, very young, although we're not exactly sure how old he was. Well, then the cupbearer, he's in the prison. He does well. He gets appointed to second in command, basically in the prison. He's over the prisoners, and some of the king sent some prisoners to be imprisoned there. His cupbearer and the baker, and of course he interprets dreams that they have. I'm not going to get into the dreams right now, but one of the dreams is good. You're going to be restored to your position. The other dream is not so good. Your head's going to be lifted up from you, and you're going to die today. And that happened. The baker is punished with death, and the cupbearer is restored to his position. And we don't know exactly what happened, why they were there behind that, but obviously some maybe attempt on the king's life or Pharaoh's life maybe have been behind that, and the cupbearer was venerated from that. But he tells the cupbearer, when you're appointed to your position again, remember me. Tell Pharaoh about me. And he goes out and he's brought back up to his position, and he doesn't think about Joseph anymore. And the text tells us that it's 2 more years that the cupbearer forgets him until Pharaoh has dreams. Look at chapter 40. Chapter 40, in the very end, very last verse, verse 23. Yet the chief butler or cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. And it tells about his dreams, and he's troubled by them. He wants someone to interpret them. Nobody's able to do it. And the cupbearer says, there was a man in prison, and he predicted this thing that has happened to me, where I would be venerated of that and put back into the position you had me in before. So we see all these hardships for Joseph. We also see his successes, and those stand out to us as well. Although he's the second youngest, it's interesting. Only Benjamin's younger than him, his full younger brother. But who's basically the foreman over all the brothers? Well, it's Joseph. He's the one with the special coat. We'll just call it that. Some versions call it the coat of many colors. But it indicates that he's special. He's in charge. He's the foreman, you might say. He goes and checks on them, although he's the second youngest. Genesis 37 and verse 13 and 14 say, And Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? So they're out working. And he says, Come, I will send you to them. So he said to him, Here I am. And he said to him, Please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flock, and bring back word to me. So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now we look later, although he's a slave in the house of Potiphar, he has success there. And he is being blessed by God. He's promoted to second in command in Potiphar's house. Chapter 39 and verse 4 says, So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. We've talked about what happened to him in the prison. As a prisoner, he's made second in command under the ruler of the prison. He's over all the other prisoners. Chapter 39 and verse 22 talks about this. It says, "And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all of the prisoners who were in the prison." Whatever they did there, it was his doing. And he's finally remembered by the cupbearer, right? And he comes before Pharaoh, interprets his dreams, tells him this is what's going to happen. 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. This is what you need to do to get your country through that. Put back a certain amount of that so that you can make it through. And Pharaoh, of course, liked what he heard and said, "You're going to be the one that I'm going to put in charge over all this. In fact, there's going to be nobody above you in this country except for me." And it says in chapter 41, if you want to turn there, starting in verse 38, we're going to read through verse 45. "And Pharaoh said to his servants, 'Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you.' And Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt.' Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, 'Bow the knee.' So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, 'I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt.' And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paaneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt." Wow. Talk about someone who's successful now after all that he's been through. Just a whirlwind of a life. And he's now 30 years old. Joseph, when we look at his life from 17 to 30, he demonstrated, and even after that, he demonstrated a lot of great character traits for a young person. Really for any of us, when you think about it. When we think about him being young, the first thing that we think about, when we think about Joseph, at least I think about, is the great faith that he displayed. As I said, he went through some awful things, but his words always reflect a great faith in God, something that we need to emulate. Think about Genesis 39 and verse 9, when Potiphar's wife is making advances towards him. And here he is, he's a young man, he's been sold into slavery, that prior life in his mind is gone. It's not going to come back. He's not going to be in his father's house anymore. And here it is, he can be footloose and fancy-free, so to speak. He can do whatever he wants. But the problem is, and this is something we need to get in our heads, we may find ourselves at a different place. Young people especially, you may get up and you may move out and you may be on your own. And away from your family, away from your friends, away from your church family, into a new place. And a lot of times, young people say, this is a perfect time. I'll cast off all those things, and I'll live a life of revelry and those types of things. But Joseph knew something that we all need to understand. Nothing is done in a corner. There's always going to be the most important being in the universe always sees. And he knew that. Listen to what he says, Genesis 39 and verse 9. "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he," that's Potiphar, "kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" That has to be where we start. That has to be where our faith lies. We're not going to seek out things that we know we shouldn't do, because God will see. We may get away with them. It may be in our own house that we can get away with things, but we'll never truly get away with anything, because God sees, God knows. And he is the one that's going to be in judgment over us. He is the one that will punish us. We have to understand that. Genesis 41 as well, verse 51 and 52, think about these words reflecting the faith that he has here. Joseph called, and this is when Joseph has children. This is after he is second in command in Egypt. Verse 51 says, Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh. And it means, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So even when he's low and things are not going his way, he thinks of God. When things are going well, going his way, he thinks of God. That's what people of faith do. We often ask ourselves the question, why does God allow suffering? Because it leads people away from the faith. I tell you, it doesn't lead people away from the faith nearly as much as success. When we think about it that way, success is much more dangerous to us than having trials and temptations. And yet, Joseph is an example of both of those and how we are to respond. Genesis chapter 45 as well. And verse 5, after he's been sold, he's been elevated to the second in position, he has gotten through the 7 years of plenty and done exactly what he told Pharaoh he should do. And now we're in the 7 years of famine. His brothers are before him, and they finally found out who he is. And of course, they're frightened. This is the brother that they've sold into slavery and lied about it. And now he is there before him, and the sheaves are bowing, aren't they? But he says in verse 5, but now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. He's later going to tell them, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That's a life of faith that can see the good in things even when it's very difficult for us. So he's such a faithful life. His behavior, even through the ups and downs that he had, how many would think that God had abandoned them while they're in slavery? I'd say a lot of us would. Joseph, however, is determined, even in the slavery, not to sin against God. Think about his dying request as a thing of faith as well. We're going to go to the book of Hebrews for this. Similar verse in Genesis 50 and verse 24 and 25. But in the book of Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 22, it says, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. He knew what God had promised, and he had such faith in it that he gave him instructions that God's going to lead you out of here. Take my bones with you when you go. That is faith. So we have his faith. We also have an example in Joseph's great self-control. Something we all need to learn. And this self-control is something that you learn over a lifetime. Okay, and it starts when you're very young. You need to be able to control yourself. Genesis chapter 39. Turn back there with me, please. Genesis chapter 39, he exhibits a lot of self-control in Potiphar's house. We've read starting there in verse, I believe it's verse 8, but we want to start back in verse 6 and read through verse 12. It says, thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day that he did not heed her, to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. He knew how to flee from sin. He had great self-control. This is something that she did day after day. And he can't leave. He's a slave. He may be in second in command in the house. But Potiphar owned him. But he knew someone greater really owned him. And that's God. He's not going to sin against God, even if somebody is breathing down his neck to do that. Look at Genesis 42. He showed self-control, didn't he, in dealing with his brothers when they did come to Egypt. Starting there in verse 6, it says, "Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. Then he said to them, 'Where do you come from?' And they said, 'From the land of Canaan, to buy food.' So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him." How many of us would have not had self-control in that situation? Here's the brothers that obviously hated you. They sold you into slavery. You've been gone for at least 13 years, probably longer than that. 13 years plus 7, that's 20. It's been 20-something years since he's seen them. And in most of us, the hatred would grow over the years. And this time when they come to bow before you, and you're in power and able to do something back to them, he showed restraint in not doing that. And actually, he knew what they were saying. And they said, "Don't you know this is probably coming on to us because of what we did to our brother?" And he leaves and he weeps over that. But he shows this incredible self-control before his brothers when they come to him. He has this incredible self-control in dealing with all this adversity and mistreatment, being thrown into prison unrighteously, and all those types of things. Self-control is crucial to a Christian. We have to understand that. And we need to be people that develop that in ourselves. Acts chapter 24, please. Acts chapter 24. Listen to what it says in verse 25. This is when Paul is speaking. I have to remind myself if it's Felix or Festus that he's speaking to here. But anyway, chapter 24 and verse 25, he's speaking to Felix as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Felix was afraid and answered, "Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you." That's part of the gospel message, isn't it? Listen to that. He reasoned him about righteousness, being righteous, the judgment to come, but also self-control, being in control of your own body, of your own mind. It is important. Look at Galatians chapter 5, verse 22 and 23. "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such there is no law." These are the fruits that you develop because of the Spirit. 2 Timothy chapter 3, starting in verse 1, says, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power, and from such people turn away." So the people you don't want to be, it says they're without self-control. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 5 through 7, where it talks about add to this, this, and this to this. Verse 5 through 7, it says, "But also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith a virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, to perseverance godliness, to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love." It is important. And he's a great example of that. We're to have self-control versus self-indulgence. And that can be just about anything. From when you're a kid, when you're young, folks, little kids, y'all need to learn. It's great to play. It's great to have fun. But when mom and dad says it's time to clean your room, guess what? It's time to stop. It's time to put away that self-indulgence and the fun stuff and do the work. Have the self-control to do that. Start learning that at a young age. And keep on with that as you get older. So we see that. Faith, self-control. We see also Joseph's great propriety, don't we? And just one example, because we're running out of time, his appearance before the king, when the king calls him out of the prison, he doesn't just show up. He's coming before the king. And even though he's coming from prison, chapter 41 and verse 14 says, "Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved He changed his clothing and he came to Pharaoh. He didn't just show up. He showed up as someone who had a good upbringing. You don't come before royalty that way, just as you are. It's not inborn, it's trained. It's training to have that kind of respect for king and occasion. Should we show respect before God in each and in every way that we can? Absolutely we should. But our society, we have a symptom. It's a casual society. Boy, we love leisure, don't we? It won't be long before we're showing up for, I don't say we, hopefully none of us would do this. But Tanya was showing me, I've got an ex-brother-in-law, and they were showing me their church services that they go to. And they're sponsored by Jack Daniels. Can you imagine? This is insane. And it is a worship band that's singing hymns set to modern country music. It is utterly ridiculous. People showing up in flip-flops and shorts, women in bathing suits and all these kind of things. It's just utterly stupid. Casual society to the nth degree. Well, I tell you, there's a lot of congregations going towards that kind of thing. A couple of years ago, we were out of town. We're taking the boys to the camp they just got back from. Thankfully, we didn't have to drive them this year and make 2 trips. Caleb just drove up there and drove back. But church service, and the guy got up to lead singing in Bermuda shorts. Well, that's not attire fit to come before and worship the King of Glory. Not in the least. Ezekiel chapter 22 and verse 6 talks about knowing the difference between what is holy and what is profane. You bring holy things before God, not what is profane. It says, her priests have violated my law and profaned my holy things. They have not distinguished between the holy and the unholy, nor have they made known the difference between the unclean and the clean. They have hidden their eyes from my Sabbaths, so that I am profaned among them. Chapter 44 and verse 23 says, and they shall teach my people the difference between the holy and the unholy, and cause them to discern between the unclean and the clean. You think it's important? Absolutely. So we see Joseph was an example of this great propriety, understanding occasion and what it's supposed to mean, and responding in the right way. We also see, very importantly, Joseph's incredible forgiveness. And boy, that's something we have to learn over our lifetime. People are going to mess up. And we're going to be at the receiving end of that sometimes. Are we going to be ones who hold grudges? He could have held a grudge and had the ability to repay, but he didn't. His words back in Genesis chapter 45 and verse 5 through 8, don't they show incredible forgiveness? 45 starting in verse 5. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Incredible forgiveness. Why? Well, because God had given him mercy, hadn't he? Look back at Genesis chapter 39 and verse 21. When he's thrown into the prison, it says, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. God could have just said, you're on your own. And the prison would have taken its toll, I'm sure. I'm sure an Egyptian prison back in 1200 BC was not a great place to be. But God was with him, and he had been shown mercy, and he now extends mercy. What about us? Well, what is our teaching on forgiveness? What was our Lord's teaching on forgiveness? We go to Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18. And I don't want to read all of that, but the Lord certainly has his teaching. He's not going to forgive unless we are forgiving. We need to be ones who are ready to forgive. How often? Well, it says 70 times 7. That's a lot. In one day, even. As often as someone repents, you forgive. That takes a great spirit of forgiveness. We need to have that, and that is difficult. So Joseph, he didn't forget God when he was in Egypt, nor did God forget him. There's a lesson in that. Sometimes we're going to feel all alone. God is with us. We have to remember that. But we have to honor him continually to get that, what he offers. So how about your faith? Is it like Joseph's? Do you give God the glory for everything? Do you have that kind of faith? What about self-control? Is your life one that's out of control? Start exercising that self-control that it talks about here. How about your propriety? Are you appropriate when you come before God? Even in your prayer life, your private prayer life? Or do you adopt what the masses of humanity have started doing for God and talking to him like he's your best friend or your boyfriend or some silly thing like that? Like he's less than the God who created everything that you see and holds it all together. That would be propriety. How's your forgiveness? Great questions, but a great example to us in Joseph. Go ahead and get your songbooks out and turn the number that's been selected. There may be one here this morning who needs to render obedience to the gospel. We invite you to do that. It's the most important steps you can make with your life. Come before him, confess his name, repent of your sins, and be buried with him in baptism, where your sins will be washed away. You can be raised to walk in newness of life. Why wouldn't you do that today? It could be that you've done those things, but you know that you're not living the life, you're not walking the way you should. Make that right today. There's no reason to keep down that path. You can make things right with him, and we are here ready to help you and ready to pray for you. So won't you come as we stand and sing together.